Good evening, everybody. I'm Fionnuala Richardson. I'm the Director of the People's College, and I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. This is the second in our series of lectures on trade unions in a time of change, and it's part of the People's College fulfilling its mission to provide education and information for workers through the college. The theme tonight is Women and the Trade Union Movement. And I think we should take a second here to remember Sheila Conroy, whose spirit is probably around the place, keeping an eye on us doing. She was, after all, one of the earliest women trade unionists and a great role model for us. And certainly in her heyday, we used to do a lot of trade union studies, which we're now hoping to recommence. Now, to introduce the two speakers, I'm sure they need very little introduction. There's Norine Greene, who is at present a member of the Employment Appeals Tribunal, but who has worked in SIPTU Unite, been active on ICTU in various committees, and played a very substantial role in the trade union movement in promoting women's issues and position. And then Mags O'Brien, who I Googled her this afternoon, and enormous amount of information. But she's at present a tutor in the SIPTU College, having been a trade union activist, and is also very involved in the Trade Union Friends of Palestine. But anyway, you probably all know them at least as well as I do, so I won't take up any more of the time and ask them to start off, whichever one.
My name is Norine Greene. And as Fionnuala quite rightly said, I'm a former union official with both Unite and SIPTU, but I also was an equality officer with both those unions and also served for many years on the Executive Council of Congress in a reserve seat position, and I was on the Irish Transport Executive on a reserve seat position as well. Just a little footnote. I know that tonight's debate is called Women and the Trade Union Movement, but I think we should put a little footnote onto that to say, have things really improved? Because that, I think, is what the broader discussion really needs to be tonight. Both Mags and myself, in discussing what we would do tonight by way of presentation, both agreed that we would limit as much as we could statistics, because statistics really do turn people off. But however, I do think that it's important that when we look at the historical role of women in the trade union movement and the current position of women in the trade union movement, that we need to look at some of those statistics. The way that we're going to present it tonight is that Mags has done this wonderful overhead presentation. I'm going to leave space and room for, I do want to comment on some of it, like the EU directives, etc., but I think it'll all flow from Mag's presentation. And I want to also leave enough room that we can have questions and, more importantly, a debate on the role of women in the trade union movement, the historical role, where we have been, where we are at the moment, and hopefully where we will see ourselves going forward. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Colin Mags, to do the presentation.
Okay, now as you can see, I've actually called this Fraternally Yours, and I have a reason for that. And the reason I have is that not that many years ago I got a letter from a female colleague in a union, and she sent it to me and she signed it Yours Fraternally. And I just, it struck me that was really that we are women within male constructs, if you like, and that the trade union movement is that. So that's why it's entitled that, and it's a bit of a slag at my brothers in the movement. But that's, that's where we feel we are, Okay, so the historical backdrop on this, first of all, you have to place the fact that women were very much in a minority in the unions, okay? And they were overwhelmingly male. Women were largely doing menial work, shirt factories, paper mills, weavers, dressmakers, that kind of thing. And the demarcation lines meant that women's membership would be resisted. And employers, though, were happy to have women workers in certain circumstances as they could pay less. And I think, you know, when we think about that, you know, if you move that up to current times, you can think about migrant workers and whatever. It's exactly the same kind of thing, really. That is Mary Galway, and interestingly, she's not very much remembered, but she was actually on the Executive of Congress in 1908, I think it was, 1908. So that's an interesting one, that there was actually a woman on the executive that far back, and as I say, she doesn't get recollected that often. And interestingly, that woman, Catherine Mahon, and anybody from the INTO recognise that, she was one of the 2 reserve seats in the INTO in 1907. So, you know, it's an interesting thing to think we go back that far. And then we come on to the biggest, you know, grouping of women then was the Women Workers' Union. And that was set up in 1911. And Delia Larkin was the first General Secretary of that. However, Jim Larkin was the president. And Jim wasn't letting go of the reins there either. And that's an interesting picture. That's women from the Women Workers' Union. And if you can see there, it says Freedom's Martyrs. And they were women that were actually imprisoned during the lockout and around then. So, you know, fairly militant. That's a copy of some of the broadsheets that the women would have posted. That was the boxmaker strike in 1928. So interesting again that they were as militant as that then. And there, you know, in the north then, James Connolly would have worked with Winifred Carney to organise textile workers in Belfast. So there were, I'm trying to just illustrate, there were very strong women there at the beginning as well, okay? And obviously the Countess, she was very instrumental in the lockout and the soup kitchens, etc. And Helena Maloney, I love the story about Helena Maloney. She was very involved as well in the union. And she was an Abbey actress, so what she'd do is she'd be on stage and she would run between intervals to address the crowds and then go back on stage again. So a colourful woman. And then again in the lockout, women were active. 3 women in Jacobs refusing to remove their badges, and there were 250 women locked out after that. And then the Irish Women Workers' Union, they gave up breakfast to thousands during the lockout and hot dinners for expectant mothers. You'll find there's a thread running through all the time that women were involved, if you like, it was the bread and roses thing, that they were involved in, you know, the hard stuff around wages, but they were also involved in things like the soup kitchens and in running social evenings and creches and things like that. During the Citizens' Army, Jenny Shanahan, Rosie Hackett, Helena Maloney, all involved, and they ran a co-op in Liberty Hall. And they stood up to the police who raided looking for copies of the Workers' Republic, but they were actually producing banners and flags and armlets, and they hid arms in Liberty Hall as well during the rising. So doughty women. And you come on then, and there seems to be not a massive amount. I mean, there were women involved, 30s, 40s. But, you know, come up to the laundry workers' strike then. And again, this is the thing I was saying about women being involved. And sometimes it was the laundry workers' strike was about getting a fortnight's holiday. And if you think about it, it wasn't so they could go on a nice little trip or anything like that, because they didn't have the money to do that. It was the fact the conditions they worked in were so bad that they thought if they had an extra week's holiday, there was only a week then, that they would actually be able to breathe. Because these women could be working all hours, working with filthy, dirty laundry. TB was rife, and they were working in freezing cold places, but using really hot water. So you can imagine what that was doing to their health, you know. So that was the laundry workers' strike, and I love that little ditty. I can't sing, so, but we actually had a play about that we might think about putting on again at some stage. And Louis Bennett was the head of the Irish Women Workers' Union. And again, 1935 there, she asked Congress to confirm its allegiance to the fundamental principle of equal rights and equal pay. Now, William O'Brien from the Transport Union he supported the motion, but he wouldn't support Louis Bennett's speech because he thought it was too radical. So again, you have this thing about the men were supporting, but not quite. So you move up 1939 there, just to give you a sample. At that stage, females 15% of the membership of the Transport Union and 12.8% of the Workers' Union, for instance. But then you come to 1945 in the emergency, and the men behave very badly again. They sought to have women excluded from certain occupations. And you see, I said to you, you have to put it in the construct of the time. And what it was that it wasn't that the men were, in their heads, were being particularly nasty. It was that the norm was that the man's wage was the family wage. And it was always felt that women were, you know, earning the pin money or whatever. So you have to look at it from that construct. However, the reality was that a lot of those women were actually supporting their families. So it wasn't quite, you know, as said. But that was where the thoughts behind it were, okay? And there was a comment on staffing in the transport union in 1947. He must be willing to make sacrifices. Low wages will not attract young, intelligent men. Yeah? And then, as you mentioned, the lovely Sheila, and their first woman member of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union and National Executive. However, when you look at it then in Francis Devine's book, which is a great source of knowledge, he states that Patrick Lally looked for typing and shorthand for male officials as men should be employed in preference to women. So again, you can see that this is the thread that runs through. Needless to say, Sheila Conroy resented the remark, saying that women in the union were a credit and contributing as much as men. And in 1954 then, Congress, a motion on equal pay, Larkin asked for a refer back on it, stating that some of the best women trade unionists were not convinced, you know, and where have we heard that one said before? But women have to pursue the principle of their own sex first before they put it to Congress, however the motion was. Then you come on to 1965, unions beginning to reassess the marriage bar. Hilda Larkin married Sean Breslin and was asked to stay on as an official in the transport union. But there's a clue in the name there, isn't there? She was Hilda Larkin, and she was one of the Larkins. So I think that maybe an exception was made. Again, there you go with our numbers again. 1969, women 32%. So you can see the way that we're beginning to have a higher number. And then in the 1970s, the same as in other places. And this is something that people actually find quite amazing, the fact that unions were just as bad as other places in that there was a marriage bar in the unions as well. And that was gotten rid of then. And there's just some of the, and I was hesitant to put up names because I'm sure I've forgotten some of the prominent people, but they were some of the women who I would have encountered anyway, and Norine sitting there. Norine was only the second woman elected to the Transport Union Executive in 1982. So if you think about it, you know, Sheila was there 50s and then not until 1982. And then you go on to workplace representation at the moment. And this is the reason I've highlighted some of those. If you look at that, we now have 51% women in Congress, okay? But when you look at that, presidents of unions, 78% male, and vice presidents, 53% female. So they're the second rank more often than not, if you like, okay? And then when you go down there, say regional committee officers, 60%, but just members 68%. 60% men, 68% female. So it's just that thing all the time that they are there, but they're not there in the higher positions, okay? And shop stewards and workplace reps there, do you see that? They've overtaken the men. So they are there, and it's often said, oh, women don't step forward. But I mean, that shows that they are there on the ground, okay? And the debate continued anyway. Una Claffey wanted reserved general executive seats. Cardiff demurred and said that number 4 branch, where women were 70% of the membership, they didn't take over. However, Ita Gannon, who many of us would know, was insulted by a remark on women's participation and reporting the FWI that apathy was the main reason for women's non-involvement. Okay? If you look at Europe now, and at the moment as we stand, there are 4 female presidents out of 48, and there were 6 in 2009, so I would suggest that we've gone backwards, okay? And 2011, 39% vice presidents, 2012, 36% vice presidents, so in both those categories. 51% women members in Congress, but only 25% of Congress executive female. And 10% of unions have a chief officer. I'm saying chief officer because in some it's the general secretary, others it's president, depending on the union. But only 5% of those are Ireland-based. So it's the British unions make up the other 5% of those heads, okay? You take some of the unions now. SIP2 has had 64 opportunities to elect general officers, right? And it has never elected a woman. I counted through and there were 64 elections in all. We now have a woman vice president, but that was on foot of a rule change that was made about 2 years ago where it was said that one of the 3 officers must be female, okay? Or must be of either sex, I think is what the rule change says. And then 25% of the national executive in that rule change must be of either sex. So that, if you like, that's reserve seats there in some ways. If you look at the INMO, and that was, you know, nurses union, predominantly female, a male general, an assistant general secretary, and then at the lower level then 3 female directors. And the executive has a female president, 1 male and 1 female vice president, and then the executive is 80% female. So again, that reflects the actual membership. And then the INCO, male president and deputy president, a female general secretary, male treasurer, male Northern secretary, and I think that figure is right. I got it from the website. So 16 executive members, 9 of whom are male, okay? TUI, male president and vice president, 14 male and 6 female members of the executive. The general secretary is male, a deputy general secretary female, and 4 male assistant general secretaries. And then ASTI, female president, male vice president, general secretary and deputy general secretary male, okay? Senior vice president, and then it has 1 female and 2 male vice presidents. PSEU, president male, the vice president female, and of the 19 executive, 7 are female. And then ASTI, a female president, male vice president, general secretary and deputy general secretary are male. So that's it. So, I mean, I didn't give all of the unions there. That was just a kind of a snapshot of some of them and some of the ones that have, you know, higher women's representation in the ranks. So that's where we stand on it. And I think, Norine, you want to take up something on the reserve seats.
Mike's actually mentioned it, but I do think it's important that I go back to the 80s because I know she was jumping from the 1900s forward. But during the 1980s, and I think it is important that we take note of this, that Ireland was forced by Europe, and I know there are some people in this room, and myself included at the time, were not big fans of the European Union. But I have to say, in hindsight, if it hadn't have been for the European Union, we wouldn't have had the equality legislation, which is in today with all of the amendments that go with it. Before I did this talk, I have nieces that range from 20 up to 30. And I was discussing with them recently, back in the 80s, when there was a marriage bar, we had to leave work if you were married, that you could work alongside a man, which I did in the former Irish press, and that man got a higher wage than you because there was a man's rate and a woman's rate. There was actually a young girl's rate as well, as I remember. And also that there was no equal opportunities. And what became famously known as the glass ceiling, I always referred to it as the sticky floor, because once you were stuck on it, you could not get up as far as even attempting to break that glass ceiling. But Ireland did resist, for those of you that remember it, they did resist the introduction of any equality legislation. And it's my view that that in itself kept women back from not only progressive in the workplace, but also from progressing in their unions. And it's worth remembering as well, I mean, I can say it now, that the trade union movement were a party to a lot of those agreements. Like in the Irish press, the trade unions were all there. The trade unions were in the public service. and they were a party to the marriage bar. So, as I say, that I firmly believe that if it hadn't have been for Europe and the introduction of all of that legislation, we would not have been able to push forward. I recall, just by way of anecdote, that I was actually a shop steward in the Irish press in my younger days before I went on to the executive of the Irish Transport. And we attempted to have a negotiations with our HR department, of course they were all men, about why, it was very simple stuff in those days, why does a man get paid more than me? There was two of them actually worked with me in the library, and the male rate. And the answer that was given was, Mag said actually, Mag's referred to the family wage, and they looked at me in horror and said, well, because men will have to look after their families. Because, of course, then, in those days, that the marriage bar, they applied it there. And also, if somebody became pregnant, there was no protection. They could actually dismiss somebody. So it was a very, very cold place in the 80s for any woman trying to push forward without the introduction of that legislation. And as I say, just when I was discussing this with my nieces, they were looking at me in total horror, as if, and they said, but we weren't even born then, like as if it was back to the 1900s. But we have a lot to be grateful for in people that Mags mentioned, such as this wonderful array of women in the Women Workers' Union of Ireland. Because those women, and if you look at the records of some of their speeches, not just the Helena Maloney's or the Delia Larkins or Helen Shenovics, the ordinary women of that union, the laundry workers, the women that worked in the printing houses, that they pushed for, in the 1900s, they pushed for equal pay. They went on strike for 2 weeks holidays, but they pushed for all of those various things to improve the workforce. So there was women that were pushing and pushing. I've brought a photograph and I didn't get time to scan it, so I'll send it around to you later. It took 30 years for me to get elected onto the executive of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. It didn't take me 30 years. There was a 30-year gap between Sheila Conroy and myself getting there. And there was 18 men on that executive and me. And people say to me now, well, it must have been really interesting for you. It wasn't. It was a very cold, lonely place to be, because every time you tried to introduce any type of progressive types of issues, with the exception of some good progressive colleagues that were on it, 2 or 3 that were on it with me, sometimes I couldn't even get a seconder if they weren't at the meeting, on stuff like reserve seats, on stuff like producing the equal pay, etc. But I do believe that when you look at those statistics, that, and I'm very proud of this fact, that there are so many young women. I think that, yes, it was my job to talk about the reserve seats, but kind of went off there a bit. But I think that the reserve seats, firstly, that were introduced in the bigger unions, but in the Congress executive, I think the original number was 2. Jim's here. 2 was the original number, and I was one of them. With the exception of Inez McCormick, who was there in her own right, there was no other woman on that executive. So it became 2, and we kept fighting, and then it became more, and it became more, until finally we have a situation now where it's not called reserve seats anymore. There's a different election system where it's a quota. People argued against, including women, against the whole concept of reserve seats. Women should be there on their own right and their own merit. Right? But that didn't happen, because there was all sorts of cabals and cartels and all sorts of stuff went on. So it was impossible to break through, and they were needed. I think that they were important, the reserve seats. I think the quota system is still important, in my view, is still important when you look at those statistics. There are many very, very fine young women and middle-aged women that are now pushed their way forward onto executives. They pushed their way forward onto the Congress executive. They pushed their way forward onto various committees and subcommittees. And I think that that is still very important. When you look at the list of, I think I was one of the first full-time women union officials within the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And that was a lonely job as well, because I worked down the country. I worked in Clare first of all, and then I went to Waterford. It was very lonely. Being a woman on your own in a country base as a union official, you know, you're not quite the whole 100%. Don't mean mentally, but you're not quite. That is the way that you're treated. And you have to battle and battle and battle to establish yourself all of the time. Now within the broad trade union movement, there are great women that I meet every day. I see them on the AIT, taking cases, etc. But unfortunately, because I'm watching this very, very carefully, unfortunately, when it comes to the higher ranks, and I look back, 1982 was the first time, 1985, I'm talking about 30 years later, that glass ceiling, that sticky floor, maybe it's not as sticky as it used to be, but it's still there, because those statistics show that the percentage of women that are within the trade union movement, it is not mirrored when you get up to the very top. So that was the reason I asked the question, have things really changed? And I wonder, is it going to take another 30 years, you know, before we have an equal par of women that are officers, are up there at that level of the trade union movement. I wonder, when you look at the affirmative action programs that are done in other countries. I prefer to call them affirmative action programs rather than positive discrimination. I've never called it positive discrimination, because discrimination is discrimination, whether it's positive or not positive. So I call it affirmative action programs. In other countries, if the majority of people in an organisation were black or came from another minority, would there be still that silence about them being at senior levels? And I would pose the question, no, there wouldn't be allowed to be that silence. So I think the debate is still ongoing. It's kind of taken backstage from maybe where it was 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, because there are so many other things that are going on now. And of course, the big debate that's going on currently is homophobia, which is a good debate as well, but we're not here on that issue here tonight, maybe another night. I think that debate is ongoing. I think it needs to be addressed. I think even in the likes of SIPTU or Congress, where you have now a lot of very, very fine and good, able women on executives, I don't think the debate is over. Not when you look at the statistics. I think that it needs to be developed, and it needs to be taken out of the closet. Can I use that phrase? Yes, I can. Taken out of the closet, dust it down and say, right, where are we at and where are we going? I think there needs to be another programme on that. So without further ado, you can ask any questions, make any statements, or disagree with us, or whatever. And thank you.
I was involved, I worked for Congress for a while. I was on Common on the Gender and Pay project, the GAP project as it was called. And I did some work around that on the whole point about women not getting involved, okay? And I mean, as a woman, I was sick, sore and tired of hearing people saying, well, they're not really interested. Because I had always been interested, people like Norine had always been interested. So, it wasn't all women. Now, I will say the first thing is I don't have children. So it was easier for me to actually go to the pub, right? And you think about it, an awful lot of what happens, and this is the whole thing about women getting involved, you have to go back about 10 years. If you want to be president of your union or something like that, you have to go back at least 10 years and you have to start doing the groundwork there, okay? And this is and you see you're smiling there, Jerry, because you know that really and truly what you need to do is you need to build up friends. You need to build up a base. And what I've seen frequently happen is that people think that all they have to do is put their name forward and they're going to be elected. Because I'm very good and I've done a load of work. But you see, the problem is Jerry has been there before me. And Jerry's gone around to everybody in the room and said, won't you support me? And of course, I haven't done the groundwork. So that's one of the first things, is that, you know, having to do the groundwork going back. You can see that's a disadvantage to women sometimes as well, because if they are in the middle stages involved and have children and can't get out as much to do the work, well then they miss that middle piece, okay? So that's some of it around it. But there's also another thing, and hey guys, whoever let go of power, and the men have the power, and the men will not cede the power lightly. They will tell you they will, but they won't, okay? And I'll give you an example, and this to me just said it all. I mentioned SIP2 and changes in SIP2, okay? There was a commission in SIP2, and I was chair of the staff association. I looked after the staff in SIP2. Was I mad or was I what, right? And I was there representing staff on this committee. Now, we were doing a fundamental change of our union. I mean, we ripped it apart and put it back together again. This commission was all about that. The two things that there were the most rows about was, one, that thing I mentioned to you about a female officer. There having to be a female officer. There was war, absolute war about that. And the other thing that was war about was whether we got rid of the Women's Committee and had an Equality Committee, okay? Those were the two things. Now, I pointed out to people, by the way, that getting rid of the Women's Committee was not necessarily a good thing. Of course, we all love equality. But now we have 9 grounds instead of 1 ground, okay? So now you have 9 lots of people that you are supposed to be promoting, and women are only 51%, aren't they? Yeah, okay, yeah. So some of the things that have happened, while ostensibly we're supposed to help, didn't help. And then one other thing I would say about this is, by nature, and you know, this is, I've seen this so many times, and I remember Joan Carmichael, who was, she was the vice, what was she, the Deputy General Secretary of Congress at one stage, and Joan said this to me, and I've seen it. You take an interview for any job, right, and you have male and female coming forward. If a man spent a week doing books somewhere, you know, say his local football association or something like that, he would say, oh, well, I'm proficient. I could do treasurer's job. I could do this, I could do that. A woman would say, well, I've done a little bit of it, right? And it's that whole thing about learning to sell yourself, that women tend not to sell themselves in the same way. So that project I was talking about, one of the things, and again, I'll mention another woman here, well, a group of women, because I neglected to mention Ina's very much in that presentation. But if you look at Unison in Northern Ireland, okay, you will see women coming forward in Unison every time. And Ines McCormick was excellent at this. Patricia McKeown is absolutely brilliant. I'd see women's conferences, global solidarity conferences. She's there, she has the women lined up. She doesn't write the presentation for them. She says to them, these are the things you need to cover. You go do. And she makes them get up to that podium. And you see, that's that difference about getting the support. And if you have that support and you have somebody behind you pushing you, you will go forward and you'll get confidence. And really, I think that's a basic thing with women not going forward. And that's why they get to a certain level. Because they are competent, but they don't have confidence. And so the two things I think for them to get to the top is to have done the forward planning, and the other one is to have the confidence that they're as good or better than any man. And I'd finish this by saying, brilliant phrase, I love this one, okay, that Fred Astaire is much better known than Ginger Rogers, isn't that right? But Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, and she did it going backwards in high heels.
Can I just come back into there for a minute? A couple of things I want to say. First and foremost, I don't accept everything you said. A lot of what you said I do accept. I think the first requirement for office within the trade union movement is the hunger for the office. I don't accept.
I know a lot of stupid, hungry men.
I admit to be one of them. I mean, my view is that if you want it, you'll go and get it. And part of the politics that you're talking about, there's politics with a large P and a small p in the trade union movement, and I'll talk about both of them for a second if I can. The small p is the getting elected to your executive committee and making it through the ranks. I was never a vice president. I went straight for the president's job, right? I agree, I needed people behind me, but there were women and men behind me who drove that, right? So a lot of it is networking, but you don't have to be in the upper echelon to get the network.
No,
right?
no, don't disagree with you on that. No.
The second point is the large P in politics. I would challenge anybody to walk out there and stop 100 people and ask them to give the name of one president and 2 general secretaries of any trade union in Ireland. I guarantee you we'd get the general secretaries' names, we'd have difficulty finding the president's names. The big P in trade unionism, the politics of trade unionism, is dying, and that's, in my view, what's killing the trade union movement. We've ceded our responsibilities to, for the want of a word I don't like, it's a dirty word in my view, the paid officials. We have left it to our general secretaries and our deputy general secretaries and our assistant general secretaries to do the work. And I have to say, SIPTU at the moment is changing that by empowering the workforce on the ground. I think that's where we've got to start. Empowering people on the ground, get them to learn to fight their own battles, stand up on their own 2 feet. And once you start to do that, and I've seen it happen in our own organisation, where you would empower a particular workforce, it's amazing to watch the transformation. Problem is we don't have enough people to go out there and do it.
But you see, I don't disagree with anything you've said, but what I will say is that you sometimes need to give women a separate space to do that first. And I would do training all the time with women. And I can tell you that once you get them up off that first hurdle of having the confidence, that, I mean, I can guarantee you, I mean, I've been a tutor for what, 9-10 years in SIPTU now. Before that was an official, so I wanted the dirty words, right? And what I would say to you is I've seen women who I trained and they're now on the national executive and they wouldn't open their mouths. So all it really is, and you see there's another thing, we've actually stopped doing some of that women's training because of the whole equality thing. And that's why I'm saying it, when you put equality there sometimes, it actually dilutes the whole thing, you know? And it's a biggie, really.
Okay, well look, we're going to be running out of time, but just something that I thought about, I'm going to do it, and I'm just going to spot pick yous, right? Because a couple of people had actually mentioned it, and I had said it in my address, and Mags had said it as well. I think that there are so many other things going on at the moment that not just women, but the whole equality agenda has taken a backstage. And what I had said to you was, I think that we need to take it back out of the closet again, dust it down and say, right, how are we progressing in all of these matters and these issues? And what I'm going to do is, I actually did this at schools, you'd be surprised at what people actually thought was discrimination. And what I do is just visualise that there's a big column there, you know, like in Egypt or something, right? And that there are 7 pillars that hold it up, okay? You take away one of those pillars, it starts falling down. So the whole society and the equality agenda starts collapsing. And what I'm going to do, so just imagine, right, and I know that that column is still going to be standing when we all come out of this room here tonight. That's if you get this right. I'm just going to pick yous. Okay, 7 areas. There's 2 pieces of legislation. One is the Equal, just to explain to you in case people have forgotten, the Equal Status Act, right, is what governs outside society where you can't discriminate, okay? The Employment Equality Act is where you can't discriminate in the workplace. 7 areas where you can't discriminate. Sorry, there's 9. I'd forgotten about 2 of them myself. There's 9, right? Okay, so there's 9 pieces, and I'm just going to go, right, Mags, you take a note. Do me little columns for me.
Okay.
All right. Okay, give me 1.
8.
Okay, very good. Yep, okay, yourself.
Sorry, I'm from Spain.
All right. Well, what would you think would be illegal to discriminate? You cannot discriminate against that person because. I'm sure it's the same in Spain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Same in Spain. Jim. No.
What, over the 9 grounds?
No, it's not on the 9 grounds.
It isn't enough.
Travelling community then.
Yes, all right. See, I didn't say anything about giving you 2 goes. He's a former General Secretary.
Yeah.
All right.
But that's not one of the grounds.
What? Travelling community. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
No, travel community is one of the grounds.
It's one of the grounds on its own. See? Yeah. He got 2 and he got right? So I tell you, you're in a dodgy spot now as well. Tony?
Disability?
Yes. Yeah. All right. Okay, yourself? No. I'll come back to you. You can think. Right, Mary?
Marital status.
Excellent. Yes.
Well, it's now.
By the way, I'm not that old. I mean, you keep talking about going back to the 80s and what you've done. I'm starting to feel old sitting here. But I have had a saying, and I've used this all through my working life and been involved in the trade union movement. I always saw myself that I was the lion and that the women that walked with me and behind me and beside me, that they were the roar. I could never have done, and a lot of good men I have to add as well, I could never have done a lot of the things that I achieved or pushed forward through executives if I hadn't have had those sort of colleagues with me. I just want to make a couple of comments on just some of the things that were raised. Mary made some very interesting points, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying. But I think we have to take into consideration also what Paul has said, that it's very easy for us to criticise ourselves without looking at other things that have happened in the interim as well. Like, as I say, when I started out, you can see this picture, I'll get it photoed and you can have a look at it. The only woman sitting in the middle of 18 men, and in those days you called the General Secretary Mr. Mullen. You called the General President Mr. Carroll. You can see them all here. Mr. Carroll, Mr. Kennedy, right? That's what you referred to them as. Because you were in awe, you saw these people on the television. I mean, things have drastically changed now. But the women that came behind me and with me, and those women that are there today, that are on women's committees, are pushing, if you like, they're pushing still. This is what's so frustrating and so frightening. They're still pushing a lot of those same issues. Maybe childcare has become a big issue where it wasn't a big issue, maybe it was an issue, but it wasn't the biggest one that we had to confront. But it's still there, and they have to keep pushing. Mary, what I would say to you, because I know that Unite does, I was the equality officer at one stage in Unite, that they have a very strong women's committee that operates on elected basis in the 32 counties of Ireland. I would recommend that you do, because you're very vocal, you have a lot to give, that you would become involved in the Women's Committee, become involved in your branch committee, and that is the way that it changes the union. That is the way that it changes there's motions that can be put down to the Congress, to your own union, and Unite, I can only speak for Unite at the moment, they have the area representatives, they have regional structures, very good structures, that weren't always there when I was there. So you can actually become involved. And if it's only one thing that you set out to do to change, in 30 years' time you'll be like me and say, well, I was able to change that with the help of other people. I want to, in particular, talk about this notion of, Mags is going to deal with getting people, more people involved, and the points that Ger was making, and your good self as well. This notion of the yellow pack workers, the yellow pay workers. In my view, it is the same as prior to the equal pay legislation. It's now called the Anti-Discrimination Pay Act, but in those days it was called the Equal Pay Act. But unfortunately, and this is being sold by the trade union movement, and it is being negotiated by the trade union movement. I'm sure if there was other people sitting here who negotiated these sort of packages, they'd have a different view and argue with me against this, right? But the difficulty with the I'm not going to bore you with this, but I think it's important that you should note this, that under the Anti-Discrimination Pay Act, I think it's section 3C or whatever, that you have to take a case, a woman against a man or a man against a woman. It is as specific as that. And I have taken, you know, the grounds of discrimination, there's, I'm going to do a test with you in a moment, if time allows me, that I have taken many of these cases, anti-discrimination pay, where women worked alongside a man. But the problem, as I see it, with the yellow pack, as they call them, I hate calling other workers that. I really hate calling them. And I think we should look at another name for it. Because it's not those workers that are the problem, in my view. It is the people who have negotiated those sorts of deals. I mean, that can be recorded. You can record me saying it and I'll repeat it 100 times over. It's not the workers, and we should not take it out. Majority of them are young workers. Majority of them, again, are non-Irish nationals, and they should be protected rather than treated as some sort of, you know, pariah, that which they're not. But the difficulty that you will see is that within that group, that there is a mixture of the sexes. So they won't all be women, they won't all be men. That is in the majority of cases that I've seen.
That was a big point, like they brought it backwards in a more insidious manner, you know. And I wasn't there in derogatory about yellow pack. I said I hated that term myself.
Okay.
It's a derogatory term, you know. And I said that they use a derogatory term such as
Terrible.
yellow pack. And also with, in fairness to my own union, the CWU, they have been working at it, I know, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it's happening all over the place. And there are a huge amount of workers that they have no one doing anything about this situation, this discrepancy, you know.
Well, I think the biggest problem, and then I'm going to hand over to Mike's, because there is a little quiz that I want to do with you. I just thought it up there a minute ago. I'm going to hand over to Mike's. I think the biggest problem as well is that I commend the CWU, they're very good, and that they are fighting, but that a lot of these lower paid workers are in jobs that are not union organised, and they don't have a voice of any description. So not only are they getting paid less money, their hours are probably different as well. They have no benefits. They're not in, a lot of them are not even in the dreaded defined contribution schemes, which are bad enough. They're not even in those. They don't get sick pay, etc. And they're in non-union jobs. And I think that's a bigger problem that Congress and the trade union movement need to address. I'm going to hand over to Migs, who maybe, Migs, you might deal with the issue that Ger and yourself raised in hard to get women, young people, more involved. By the way, there was a great saying that I heard a woman, actually, when I tried to encourage her, sorry, Migs, tried to encourage her, it was in Waterford, to come along to the branch meetings, and to which she said to me, meetings, more bloody meetings. And that was, in other words, no, I'm not going. And I always remembered that. So I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. Sorry, Migs. You missing? Have you, Migs?
No, I've 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so I'm missing 2.
What are the 7 years?
Okay.
I have civil status, religion, age, gender, membership of the travelling community, disability and race.
I'll come back to you because I didn't get you. This, yeah. You got the 7. All right. All right, Paula.
Sexual orientation.
Yes. Yes. Well done, Paula. Now we've one missing, and everybody misses this one. Everybody misses it. I know what it is, but everybody misses it.
No, we have race.
We have race. You got age, didn't you, Mike?
Yep, yeah.
Are you bringing it up? Let's say. Okay, I'll read them out to you. Okay, the 9 grounds, right? Because I knew it, that means that the column is still standing. Okay, we can sleep easy. Gender, marital status, family status. Everybody misses family status. family status, sexual orientation, religion, age, disability, race, and membership of the traveller community. It's actually interesting because in the north there's different legislation. I mean, I have been campaigning for years that they would simplify it down into the two main ones, like at least we have that. But in the north, if you want to take a discrimination case, you're running from one piece of legislation to the other. It's very, very confusing. And with ours, it's different. But in the north, somebody said political affiliation. Who said that? Your good self. In the north, that is one of them. Trade unionism, that is in England, they have that. Under the Unfair Dismissals Act, which I think Jim was probably thinking about, under the Unfair Dismissals Act.
You're giving him a rope.
Under the Unfair Dismissals Act, it is illegal to dismiss somebody on the basis of their trade unionism. But it's not under the axis of the discrimination. So listen, well done. 8 out of 9 wasn't bad, right? Give yourself a round of applause, and we've enjoyed it. I hope you have as well.
So I'd like to thank the two speakers for a very interesting, stimulating talks and discussion. And the discussion part of it was almost as interesting as the input. The next lecture in this series will be Etna Fitzgerald on freedom information, another pioneering women. And then the final kind of housekeeping thing. There's no obligatory cost, a price for this series of lectures, but we will welcome voluntary contributions from people. And I think there's a box, I don't know whether it's immediately outside the door. So anybody who feels they would like to contribute, we'd be very grateful for it. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to the speakers.